because one of the things I should point out is that Kim and I and Yoshiki have our salaries paid for outside of UCLA. Right? So we're
Yoshiki is our colleague.
Yeah, Yoshiki. Yeah.
Yeah. You may see him here, you may see him there
Yeah.
over the course, so he's going to be in both places.
He's the
He
elusive,
may not be here.
the elusive Pimpernel. So basically, the reason we do this course is for two reasons. One is it's just a nice thing to do with students in another country. And the second thing is we very often meet a couple of special students from holding this class that wind up doing some intern work with us and stuff. So this is a little bit of a student attraction thing. We're looking for people who are really interested in this stuff, because believe me, people who are not really interested in this stuff have a hard time gutting their way through the tough parts of design. Well, the stuff I've been talking about. And I think I've hit a lot of different things. So it's the diffuse nature of the subject matter is pretty apparent now. What is this course about? But the other way of looking at it is that what it means is that, just as Plato pointed out, in any society of reasonable size, you can let people choose the things that they're interested in, and you'll get good coverage. Right? So the only books, I've read close to 20,000 books in my life, and the only books I didn't read when I was supposed to were the ones who were assigned to me in school. And the reason for that was that part of being a reader, part of the speakers for part of it, and they will also do a number of classes also. Okay, so 332 or 432. So first, let me just ask if people have any questions right now, because I would love to ask them, answer them. And by the way, everybody I think is always interested in what do I have to do to get a grade? But those of you who aren't automatically get one extra grade point. On the other hand, I'm happy to try and explain it insofar as I can. But one of the basically it's quality of effort. When I was in grad school, the idea as a PhD was 2 or 3 years of top quality work, and if you worked on an easy problem, you were supposed to get it done, and if you worked on a hard problem, you didn't have to. So they didn't trap graduate students. Mine was on personal computing, so of course I didn't get done. But fortunately, they gave me. I'm still working on it. But basically, the same deal in this class. This class is going to be diffuse as far as the range of subject matter, because we purposely wanted a range of students and students interested in different things, and students have learned something about different things. So in order to keep the class from dissolving into oatmeal, it's up to the students to take sharp foci on things. And I'll try and guide you a little bit about how to do that. So one of the things that will definitely contribute to our feeling of quality of effort is to come to class. So it's the one thing that's not an option. Most of the action in this class is going to take place right in here. Another part of it is a thing that we call a brain barf. And for some of you, this will be easy, and for some of you, will be a little bit more difficult. But a brain barf is a written utterance that is a stream of consciousness, except that it has to have good reasoning. Okay, so it's not exactly like a blog, if you do blogging. So we're not exactly interested in unadorned opinions. It's not like /dot, for those of you who know what that is, which is complaints from the depths of misery, usually. Okay? But opinion is incredibly important. And what a brain barf is a half page to a couple of pages of prose about something that's related. The first one I want you to do is really results in just a couple of sentences, which is, if you were going to go back to the time of Sherlock Holmes, which is about 100 years ago, and you could take two things, they could be ideas, practices, processes from our time back there with you, what would you take back? You might think about why it might be interesting to go back a century. What is the point of that? But you also might think about what you would actually take back.
Do you want these posted to the web, or are they private?
I think bring them in first, and we'll talk about how we'll post these things. One of the ones that's coming up that I want to tell you about a little bit, because the critical thing here is don't do too much work on these. Absolutely don't, because then it gets to be something very, very different from your thinking processes. Right? So I'm absolutely not interested in causing you any work that isn't positive with respect to where you get to in your thinking on this. So the whole point of the barf part of the thing is to just splat it out there. And I will be very tolerant early on. However, we will mark them up. But I'm not going to grade them. All I'm going to do is mark them up and give you a suggestion about how you might have done it slightly differently. So this is just a technique. Some of the best thinkers that I know do these things because there's something about trying to articulate something on paper that helps your thinking processes. And if you can get so you can just do it, right? So the thing to do is just start, and when you get to a certain place, stop and hand it in. Don't mess around with it. Don't put yourself into a situation where you feel like you're doing a lot of work on this thing, because believe me, it's not going to help. So what we want is you to feel like it's no big deal when I say, hey, do a brain barf on this idea or pick something out of this set of things. Okay, so any questions so far? That wasn't rhetorical, by the way. So part of the deal here is I like to talk, and so it's your job to prevent me from doing that.
Won't class participation also count for a big chunk of their
Yeah. Basically,
assessment?
like I say, this is one of these things where the trade-off between quality of effort and quality of result is complex. My belief is that on a design project like this, quality of effort counts for a hell of a lot. So it's really, a lot of it has to do with your particular approach, the kind of depth you're able to get to. And by the way, let me say just a few words about the focus for this particular class. In the past, we've looked at elementary school education around the world, but mostly in cultures that are somewhat similar to ours, cultures that have the Industrial Revolution. And we are actively involved in quite a number of projects around the world, and most especially a number of big projects in Japan, hence our connection with Kyoto University, and another big one in Spain. And we've been doing this for a relatively long time. So we actually have some momentum behind that. But this year, my old friend Nicholas Negroponte, I think most of you know who he is. He is the guy who did the Media Lab. Can we possibly get rid of that hissing? Yeah, but we don't. We don't need to hear it. Okay, but they will wave if they.
Yeah,
I think
they're primarily
today they're just listening in.
They can't, I would think.
They want to hear us. Can you hear us? Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, great. So Nicholas is a guy I've known for 40 years or so. And you know him, I think, best for being the head of the Media Lab and being a kind of a world figure. And before Nicholas got famous, he was one of the 2 or 3 best user interface designers on the planet in the 1970s. And he also is extremely interested in a subject that most people in the 60s and 70s in computing were interested in, which was saving the world. That sounds really weird today to say that, but that's a large part of what the deal about personal computing and networking and all that stuff was about. It was a conscious sense that the computer could possibly be the next great thing after the printing press, and it could possibly have a much bigger influence on a larger part of the world. And so Nicholas, I guess a year or so ago, went to Michael Dell and said to Michael, now come on, it's okay for you to make a lot of money off Americans, but it's possible to build a $100 laptop, and the other 5/6 of the world desperately need it, not for accounting, not for biznobabble, not for watching movies on, but for, by God, learning the things that are necessary to learn to be in a different relationship with nature and each other. So that was the pitch he gave Michael Dell. And Michael blew him away. And Nicholas is the kind of guy, as you will find out when you meet him, you'll be visiting us in a bit. He's not the kind of guy that anybody blows away. So he got pissed off, and he decided, okay, we will do a $100 laptop. Now, of course, this is something that's been talked about for a long, long time. And the source of Nicholas's theory of starting this project was that this last year, there were about 50 million laptops made worldwide and sold for, $800, $900 up to a few $1,000s. But in that very same year, there were 650 million phones made. And these phones, it's complicated exactly what they cost. But the most interesting thing about most phones today is they have a 400 or 500 megahertz 32-bit processor in them and a fair amount of memory. And so Nicholas's idea, well, is if you can just get a cheap display and put it on a phone instead of a display that doesn't have enough pixels to do much, you would actually very likely be able to have a $100 laptop because you'd have wireless networking and a whole bunch. So that was the genesis of this project, and Nicholas has gotten a bunch of big companies roped in on this, and he has some buyers. So his pitch to countries is you must minimum order is 1 million of these computers, and you must publicly declare that you're going to get a laptop to every child in your country. So he's already sold 2 countries on this proposition. One of them is Brazil. I can't mention the other one. He, of course, has visited China, which has 239 million children in school up through 9th grade. Interesting figure, which is close to the population of the United States just in children. And so one of the interesting things, another company that's involved in this is AMD, who is supplying all the chips on the thing. So there are big companies involved and of course, no Microsoft software, all free software on this thing. And so it's a very, very interesting counterculture kind of project done by one of the people who brought this technology to us today from 35 years ago. So he's roped a bunch of people in. We're working on it. And there are 5 different technologies that could be the $5 to $25 display. So the display is the critical part of this thing to get the price down. And of course, if you imagine in your mind a plug in the wall, and then hardware, software, user interface, user experience, if you have all of those things, then you finally get to the squishy human there, the person that most computer people hate. And then that human is embedded in a social structure, and that social structure usually thinks it's the only social structure on Earth. So if you pull back out, there are a bunch of social structures, and there's the ecology of a planet, and there's a whole bunch of other things. And if you just think about that progression, the easiest thing there is to generate that electricity over there. And then things get progressively more difficult as we move along. So we could say that the user experience part that the user interface is supposed to generate for most users has been pretty doggone disappointing. Like Microsoft's version of the interface we invented at Xerox PARC 35 years ago is pretty darn bad. User experience is pretty low. The original theory behind that interface was for children, but people take training classes to learn how to use that interface today, right? So this is the irony of what I think of as a huge low-pass filter of reality from nice designs in the lab. When they come out and get commercialized, they get commercialized willy-nilly. And so if you think about the reason for making a worldwide inexpensive laptop for children, it has to be with the content and experiences and the kind of learning that we'd like the children to do, right? So that's worse than designing a user interface. So we have to think about content. That's what this class is about. And we'll talk a little bit about the hardware, but hardly any. We'll talk a little bit about user interface per se, but what we'll really talk about is your opinions for what it is that a bunch of people who basically, I've missed a few meals in my life, but anybody who's ever traveled anywhere in the world realizes that Americans missing a few meals is the height of luxury to most people. We have museums for the Holocaust, and we should, because we don't want to forget stuff like that. That was 10 million people over a period of 8 or 9 years. But if you go onto the internet, you'll discover immediately that the number of children who die each year from easily preventable causes is 10 million. So one Holocaust of children every year. And there are no museums for these children because they're not from our culture. So who gets interested in doing these projects? And this is where it gets really interesting, because the range of people, this is true in the 60s also, not everybody has the same. There was a comic strip by the name of Little Abner. Some of you might remember it. And Little Abner had, his mother, Mammy Yoakum, was known for her pithy speech. And one of the things she liked to say is that good is better than evil because it's nicer. And so that was her theory for, and her rationalization for doing good. And so the 60s had a lot of people who were about doing good because it was nicer. But on the other side of the coin, there are many people in the 60s who are also trying to do good in self-defense. These are the people who thought, boy, in an age of the airplane, we cannot afford to have epidemics and pandemics. Right? Even though people on this side of the spectrum might think that it's okay to have the penalty for incompetence or lack of knowledge or bad luck be death. People on the other side say, no, it's absolutely, the penalty for bad luck or incompetence should not be death. But the point is, it doesn't matter where you come from. If you think about us being trapped in this one ecosystem on the planet, it's pretty darn clear that we can't afford to let the third world get any further out of whack. And that does not mean that the first and second world know what they're doing, right? On the other hand, if we take ideologies out of it, and I think we should, I think the basic moral place for stepping in and trying to do something simply has to do with children dying, right? Because whatever we want to blame adults for or not to blame them for, we certainly can't blame the children for dying. So, for example, I don't believe Seventh-day Adventists should prevent children from getting blood transfusions if that's what they need, no matter what they believe, right? I just don't think, because now the adults can maybe decide one way or the other, but for a child, when somebody else is making that decision, I don't think they should make it. And the same thing is, I don't think we should let children die because they have bad water. I think we should make the water better. We should teach people how to make the water better. And how many biologists showed up to this? Chemists count. There's a chemist. She was a victim who strolled by this afternoon, and we managed to. But we need you, because it's possible that hardly anybody in this room knows what reverse osmosis is, and I know that you do. And if you don't know what reverse osmosis is, it's one of the most important inventions of the 20th century, and hardly anybody has it, because it allows you to drive osmotic reactions in the opposite direction and desalinate water, for example, and get a bunch of other things out of there. So a lot of this stuff is simple knowledge in the knowledgeable world, and is not known about by 95% of Americans and virtually 100% of the other 5 billion in the world. So there are many things like that that could be a special interest of somebody.
So is the point of getting laptops out to everyone just spreading information?
Well, that's part of. Now, I have my own opinion about that. So I joined up on that project regardless of this class. But I'll tell you my opinion, even though I want you to formulate one of your own. So I'm fascinated with history. And when I first saw, I was working on a desktop computer in the 60s, which I thought of as being a tool for professionals. And I ran into Seymour Papert, who was working with the early logo stuff with children. And that changed my mind from thinking of the computer as a useful thing to something that was central, like the printing press. Because once children can learn ideas through it, you actually have something that's more like a medium of expression, not just a vehicle to take you somewhere, or a tool that you can turn nuts and bolts with. And that got me thinking about the printing press. And when the printing press appeared in Europe, only one person in 100 could read. And the richest man in France, who was a bibliophile, had 142 books. And the largest library in Europe was the Vatican Library, and it had 372 books. Right? And the reason they knew they had 372 books is because you can count accurately 372 of something. So a large library in Florence, which is still there, they preserved it, you can go there and look at it. It's worthwhile looking at because it has 60 desks. Each desk has a book chained to that desk. Chained because they're worth millions of dollars and that they cost 10 to 12 years to copy. And no shelving. You don't need shelving if you only have 60 books, right? So just what was thought about, the way people thought about it, had partly to do with the amount of contact they were able to have with different perspectives. So one of the most interesting things about books was not even that they had worthwhile knowledge in them to start off with, but just all of a sudden you were in contact with many other points of view. And the printing press allowed the books to be made cheaply enough so that you didn't have to learn in a class like this. All right, so part of the difficulty in a class like this is we have a social situation, whereas what was great about the book, especially the little books made by Aldous, is that people can take them off by themselves. And they're thus extremely subversive. People started thinking their own thoughts, and the change in point of view about who you were in society and who you were as a person is largely due to the advent of the printing press. And it goes on and on. The ability of the press to exactly reproduce the proofwritten galleys started changing the writing style and the arguing style. And finally, when we get to the 17th century, the style of argument had changed from appealing to the authorities of the past to just trying to be tightly reasoned logic. Page numbers in books were not put there until 65 years after the invention of the printing press. Now think about that. Why weren't there page numbers? And why did it take 65 years for them to be invented? Let's open that up, because that's an interesting thing. Anybody got any?
Well, no. Were there page numbers before that?
Not in Western mainstream culture books. No, there are no page numbers. I'll tell you the exception later.
Because there weren't enough books originally for the usefulness of page numbers to become clear.
Well, it's an interesting thing that the average press run in the printing press was only 2,000 copies. So each town had their own press, and they would do their own printing for books in the town. So there's no reason to, and the books tended to have different pagination, right? They were typeset differently. So there was absolutely no use of a page number to refer to some other book. So, yeah.
I was going to say that they would break this if books were hand copied or something. They probably didn't have the same information on the same page anyway, so you couldn't use a page number as a reference.
Right.
Which means it was
Yeah, and with an interesting exception, which I'll get to in a second. By the way, the sequencing of books overlapped for more than 100 years afterwards. The sequencing was done by putting on the next page the last two words of the previous page. I have some books printed in the 18th century that have page numbers and still retain that practice. Yeah.
I think the custom was if you referred to another text, to copy over a large portion of what you're referring to, because finish the statement one time you have the book.
Yes, people would do that.
So it made page numbers much less useful because you never referred to page numbers. You have to block the text.
Yeah. So there are a lot of reasons not why page numbers were not that useful. And as far as anybody can tell, they were invented in 1516 by Erasmus, who was one of the great minds of that time, and by Aldous, who had been a scholar before he became a printer. And the apparent reason for inventing page numbers was that Erasmus had realized, he'd realized this thing about galleys. Once I proof that galley, the printing press is just going to make me 2,000 copies of that. So I can actually extend the kind of reasoning I'm doing in there by referring to things that I've said before and things ahead. So the page numbers are put in there for hyperlinking things in the same book. And it changed the way of reasoning to eventually squeeze out, for instance, in the 17th century, is not considered to be good reasoning to say this is true because Aristotle said it. Whereas in the Middle Ages, it was absolutely good reason to say this is true because Aristotle said it. And if you think about that change, that's one of the biggest changes in human history, because our legal system is actually essentially says this is true because Joe Blow said it in 1872. We don't know who Joe Blow was, and we don't know why Joe Blow said it, but the fact that it did get said back then affects every court case that we have. Okay, so I'll say just one other thing in answer to your question there, and that is that in the 60s, when the ARPA funders, Advanced Research Projects Agency of the Department of Defense, had a few bucks left over from funding the space program. And they decided to give it to a psychologist by the name of Jacob Licklider. And Licklider is one of these very, very special people. And he decided to use this to cause interactive computing and networking to get invented. This is cool. So he thought about how neat it would be in 1960 to do this. And a couple of years later, some of his friends in the Pentagon gave him $25–30 million to spend. That was more then than it is now. And so he started funding a couple of major universities to try and do what was called the ARPA dream, which was, he said, the destiny of computing is to become some kind of complementary partner for human beings, all human beings, and to be networked pervasively over the surface of the Earth with what he called the intergalactic network. And the reason he called it the intergalactic network was because he didn't want the technical people to invent a small network, as IBM was constantly doing. What he wanted one was that was, as it used to say, as pervasive as the power, wherever there's a power plug in the wall, the idea is there should be a network connection. And so the graduate school that I wound up going to was one of the 15 places that was getting money from this group. And what was cool about it, and it really will affect the way this class goes, is that Licklider never changed his vision into goals. So he funded people who were actually at odds with each other. He funded people who hated each other, who they had their own theory about what this destiny was. And because of that, he got one of the richest research funding in history. An enormous amount of the technology we have today came about because of his particular way of thinking about things. And so the idea there was, even if you're bending over backwards not to shove Western Civ down the throats of everybody else in the world, there's no question that exposing people to multiple points of view and also the strongest, most powerful ideas that have been thought up is a good idea. Was the premise back then. And the way to do it is we have to have somehow inexpensive ways of what I call the Dynabook, the equivalent of a dynamic book that connects into this network and allows you to do the special extra things that computers can do. That's my opinion is, part of the deal in this class, though, is I think everybody has already started thinking about what it is that you would do and what it is that you wouldn't do. For instance, the thing I believed in and still do was the idea of what was called appropriate technology. Schumacher wrote a book called Small is Beautiful back then, and I'll tell you one little story from that book. So how many people here have heard of the Green Revolution in India? I love America, So in India there are 1 billion people. And about 50 years ago, they were in deep, deep trouble because they had to import a rather large percentage of their food and they were poor. India also has a really interesting statistic, and that is they have more people with advanced degrees in college than we do. So interesting trade-off. Then they've got 1 billion people who live in deep poverty. So they have about 55 million people with advanced degrees. And they decided to try to reverse they had a 20-year plan to try and reverse the food problem for a continent with 1 billion people on it. And interesting combination of the people with the degrees worked out a form of hybrid seeds that would allow them to have 2 plantings without depleting the soil in India. And then the social revolution was to try and get all of the farmers in India to change the habits of centuries to till the soil in a different way. And so one of the early theories in this is, well, we'll do this by bringing in tractors, Western farming. And they quickly discovered that the Western tractors compacted the soil, and the soil rapidly became arid. It wouldn't hold on to water anymore. The water just shed off, and they were actually wound up ruining the fields with this stuff. And they didn't have time to breed all the horses. What they needed was horses, like the Amish use. And they didn't have time to breed all the horses for 1 billion people. And so eventually some bright person got the following idea, which was, what if we took a 2 horsepower lawnmower engine and put a capstan on the lawnmower engine and put the lawnmower engine on a plow? Then we could take a rope and stretch it all the way down the furrows there and hook the rope into a thing that we pound into the ground, and we can just let this 2 horsepower lawnmower engine just pull the plow without any down pressure at all, pull the plow right through the soil. And we should be able to get much more efficiency in plowing. So that's what they wound up doing. So that's an example of a small is beautiful thing. When I teach an engineering class, I usually get the engineers to try and think along those terms. Because today an engineer at UCLA couldn't design a flush toilet without a couple 100,000 transistors. And flush toilets have been around for a long time. They're wonderful technology. They don't need any transistors. So part of the deal in this class, remember this is a design class, so part of the deal in this class is if you choose to take a shot at this without using high tech, like you say, okay, the $100 laptop is trendy and it's kind of cool, but maybe that's not what, maybe I want to use my $100 for something else. And maybe I want to go in a different direction, or maybe I want to convince them. For instance, the thing I've thought about a lot, and I think that South Africa absolutely needs it more than they need anything else, is they need an Amish 19th century farm. And the reason is because that technology is a really great way of learning technology. So if you think of what it means, Americans are very untechnological now. We're darn close to a third world country now. And this is in part because of the black box nature of the stuff today. But my generation grew up with old cars on farms, like Model Ts and Model As, and they could be taken apart and put back together by any 12-year-old. And a lot of what our gadgeteering and interest in mechanical and civil engineering came out of this impulse to just take things apart and put them together. And so if you're thinking about some larger thing where you're not just trying to paste a developed culture onto an undeveloped culture, but there's some learning curve in there, you might decide, screw it. Forget about the computer, that's the wrong deal. I'm going to go a different direction here. I'm going to figure out a way of just draining swamps. Romans were the greatest swamp drainers of all time, and they didn't have computers to do it. So one question I wanted to ask the class, and again, there's some things in this class that you're not going to be able to find on the internet. But some of the things really are. Like one of the things I really want you to look at on the internet is the 3 great plagues of history. Does anybody know what they are? Any plague fans here? Yeah, bubonic was one. It was 100 million people. Yeah, Spanish flu, another 100 million. Yeah, smallpox is not of that magnitude, but I'd throw it in, let's say 4. The smallpox had a tremendous advantage that none of the other ones did, and that is that Jenner was a very observant guy. Everybody knows this story. You notice that cowpox, exactly. So vaccination got started about 80 years before there was even a germ theory of disease, which is good because smallpox is a virus. Right? So that part of the problem with the Spanish flu is that it would pass right through porcelain filters that would trap bacteria. So they had no idea what the darn thing was. Okay, so what's the fourth great plague that we know about? How about AIDS? So it's interesting, it's contemporary, so we don't think of it as a plague, but guess what? It's also slated for 100 million. It's the first plague in history that is not an equal opportunity plague. All other plagues killed everybody without any discrimination. The bubonic plague was especially susceptible to Christians because they prayed in churches and this facilitated the fleas jumping around. But aside from that, the plagues were quite equal rights plagues. But the AIDS one isn't, because the people who understand what it is have made huge strides in changing it. The people who don't have that knowledge is another one of these interesting things. You know, Western values or not, why should 100 million people die in the world because they don't know what a plague is? Right? So if you go at it with these fundamental things of just people living and dying, and children living or dying, this stuff is fairly simple. You don't have to mess with the larger parts of the cultures, although there is no possible way to bring noses. There was a bunch of people who actually had a sense of making a system that had to run for hundreds of years with millions and millions of mutually incompatible parts, namely us. And it was not an accident. It was done extremely well, better than most systems people can do today. So, but we want huge diversity of supported opinion here. And we also want to find ways when it's a good idea of getting people to work together. Because sometimes 2 or 3 people together can pool the things that they're interested in and get some synergy. Other times it won't work. To do with personalities. Yeah. So yes.
I had a question that it's a little bit more focused than this philosophical argument we get. But earlier you mentioned about viewing this $100 computer as a new media form instead of sort of a transmissive vehicle.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't really see that
Okay.
substantiated in your arguments.
Okay. So well, I wasn't arguing on that, but I will now. So the argument there, one of the things that we thought about a lot in the 60s when we were thinking about trying to invent personal computers was, if you look at the printing press, one of the most interesting things about it was it allowed a few new ways of arguing that didn't exist before. I mentioned what those were. So let me ask you, could you imagine a brand new way of arguing that can only be done reasonably on the computer?
No.
Okay, so turns out it's being about 3/4 of all science today is being done using arguing you can only do on the computer, namely simulations. So even when I was in graduate school, the general shape of most of the sciences was in terms of differential equations and symbolic integration of them, with a little bit of numerical integration. For instance, I was a systems programmer at NCAR, the National Center for Atmospheric Research, in the 60s, and they were just started doing some weather simulations. And the interesting thing about physical phenomena in nature is that most of it isn't really linear. And so most of the interesting things simply can't be handled with conventional math. You can't really say much about them by just looking at the individual continuous form differential equations. But as soon as you have a computer, all of a sudden you can start doing things that are almost impossible to do. For instance, classically you can't solve the three bodies under gravitational forces in more than a few special cases, but a 12-year-old can trivially do it for an entire solar system in Logo. Right? So all of a sudden, you have a different way of arguing, and one of the most interesting things you can argue about are things like epidemics. You can argue about water flow in a way that is simply not possible before the computer came along. So the interesting question is that fact profound, or is it just an extension that's not terribly profound? So we said, oh, this is profound, because particularly if we get children to learn how to think this way, they'd be thinking the way no adult has ever thought before. They'd be thinking in terms of making models of their assertions and seeing what those models do in a way that no human brain could possibly do it. So that's what we said. So my argument for trying to invent a laptop computer back then was the reason we have to do this is because it will extend the range of kinds of thinking, particularly systems thinking, that our brains are terrible at. Right? So that might be of interest or not. And it's likely that there's some more trivial ones. But one of the most interesting trivial things that we have happen today is, how many people in this room, when something comes into your mind or you're in conversation with somebody, just type that sentence into Google and see what it brings back, right? I do. Because it's not that Google is smart at all, but what it's really interested in is it takes you to a place where you might not have the crispest knowledge and shows you a bunch of opinions quicker. So I find I tend to follow more ideas than I ever did in the past. Because most of these ideas I'd have, I might write them down in a notebook, but I wouldn't go to the library to go find out about them. Whereas in Google, I follow them down a couple of levels before I give up on them. That's trivial compared to the simulation idea, but it still could be a big difference for many, many people.
Frankly, I think it'd be a big difference in this class. I'm sure Alan's going to throw out names of people and historic events and places, and you guys write down some stuff you don't know what he's talking about. You don't know who Seymour Papert is? Go through that in Google tonight and go find out. You don't know McLeod that he mentioned. These plagues, whatever little snippet piques your interest. I think it's great that we all have that available to us as well.
Now, one thing I also wanted to mention today, and I'll mention it a little bit on Thursday, so it'll be a little bit redundant, but one of my degrees is in biology, and I went to, every 4 or 5 years, I try and go to a worldwide biology conference just to listen to what the biologists are talking about. And I can barely follow them now. And the last one I went to was called BioVision, and it was a spin-off from the World Economic Forum, sort of the biologist version of the World Economic Forum. So it was 1,000 biologists from all over the world in Lyon, France in 2002. And what was, and of course they had a program, and a lot of it was about eating. But what was interesting is that the undercurrent at this conference, and finally they decided to organize a special session about 3 days into the conference. The talk biologists were about the major problems that the world is facing. And there was considerable consensus. So most of these 1,000 people picked 2 things that were more important than any other to worry about right now. So anybody got any guesses about, pardon?
Global warming?
Nope. That was in the top 10.
Malaria?
Nope. Close though.
Anything to do with failure of ecosystems?
So these are all long-term things. The malaria thing is, I said it was close because it is actually a It's a problem right now. So these were things like, if we're going to drop everything and work on something for the next 5 years, what are the 2 things that we should work on? This is no. So I'm not trying to be mysterious, but it was interesting. 2 things were drinkable water. 70% of the world's population does not have water good enough to drink. Okay, so here's an interesting thing. So just as a little, just for your own satisfaction, just go on the net and see if you can find the trade-off between antibiotics and sanitation. And we'll talk about it on Thursday, okay? Just see if you can find out what that trade-off is. It's shocking. And the other one, maybe even more important, was the education of women. And this is something to really think about. If you are interested in kind of the general themes of this class, this is something to really think about. Why? Why women? Why is the education of women considered to be one of the 2 top problems in the world by these 1,000 biologists?
It allows you to indoctrinate children, like in the case of the fundamentalist Islamic approach.
Yeah, it's part of it is, I mean, there's 3 or 4 different things, but the general, and this is borne out by anthropological studies, that there's a really strong sense in which women are the carriers of civilization. In 3 or 4 important ways that our culture is not particularly in touch with. But one of them is the contact with the children. But another one is the birth rate is entirely connected with the education of women. No other set of things affects the birth rate as strong as that, because it has to do with the women thinking about themselves as people and what their lives are like. And so, and there are 3 or 4 other really important reasons. So one of the things that would be an excellent focus for this, for some of the people in this course, is just to think about what that means. Suppose you just took that as the problem. Suppose the problem wasn't just educating children. The problem is take a 20-year shot, and can you change the balance of educated women in the world that are having children? The water thing is this is why the malaria thing is connected to it, because that's where the mosquitoes breed. A whole bunch of things. And if you get on the net, you'll find the demographics of how the 10 million children per year die from what? Enormous amount of it is dehydration from dysentery, having to do. Some of it is directly from diseases that are in the water rather than indirectly, and some of them, I think it's close to 4 or 5 million, close to half, I think, is malaria. Now, this is why the Gates Foundation is doing more than most organizations just by getting shots for malaria. Right? So that's an important. Dysentery. But in fact, as we'll hear from you next week, I mean next time, take a look and see what the trade-offs are between just changing the sanitation habits and the sanitation awareness, and what that actually translates to in terms of world health. Right? So the idea here is the range of interest in this class could stem all the way from the simple technologies of new user interface designs, new user interface agents. Right? So it could be high-tech and not terribly people-oriented. Right? But of course, one designs user interfaces without thinking about people at their peril. But there's kind of a high-tech part of this thing. And then there's various levels of many more difficult problems that, as you get closer and closer to dealing with the human beings themselves and the human beings embedded in their belief structures, which are mostly invisible to them, and so forth. In practice, one of the things we will introduce to you is the system that we've been using with children for the last 7 or 8 years, that many, many children all over the world are using. And this system will also allow you to make new user interfaces in it, or curriculum, and so forth. And you may have your own favorite authoring system. Some of you may be Flash authors. So we don't really care that, but we will show you what kinds of things that children have made and the kinds of things that adults have made in this system. And many of you, I think, will probably wind up picking something that they think is really important for some person to learn, and will think about what you would do to explain that thing that you think is important. Right, so that would be a typical great project to do at the end of this thing. Some of you will be a little more nutty. We welcome that. And we'll take on some of these larger things. You don't get extra credit for taking on the larger thing, but it's open. And we'll judge those in a different way. So you might wind up writing saying we really must do X, Y, and Z, and here's why, and here are some hints about how we go about it. Right, so you could use the thing that you're most interested in right now. I personally loved classes in school where my favorite class as an undergraduate was the Shakespeare class, which is probably the least of my 4 big interests back then. It turned out to be the greatest class because I was not prepared for how great it was going to be. It just completely shocked me and made me into a different person. Right, so you can go with your interests, or you can go diagonally against your interests. It could be really interesting. Okay, specific questions. Thank you, by the way, for asking yours.
So I know some of you guys are burning with really little, teeny, silly sounding logistical things, and that's what I'm here for, because you can tell that Alan doesn't pay much attention to that kind of stuff. So let me just let you know that I'm here, and afterwards we can let Alan go and talk about things like PTE numbers and totally getting enrolled in the class.
What are
and
they?
Stuff like that. I'm the person to talk to about that. But importantly, you should
However,
feel really free.
let me introduce Kim here because she's being too modest. Kim is the executive director of our nonprofit institute, and she is responsible for most of the experiments that we've done with children over the years. So she's a wolf in sheep's clothing here, and she and I have been partners in this enterprise for almost 20 years now, right? Yeah. And we're still friends. It's amazing.
So yeah, but I'll handle the logistical stuff, the smaller, the stupid stuff that we all have to deal with in this class, according to the institution where we're sitting. But you should all know, please, to feel really comfortable with anything, you email both Alan and I.
Yeah.
Now, don't hassle him with like a PT. He barely knows what a PT
I don't know what
number
PT,
is.
but
It's a permission to enroll number. But
please,
you know,
please,
that's-
for anything,
But we're both really open.
yeah,
for
we love
email.
email.
And
We
if
absolutely want to see it.
It could be, any level.
Anything.
Like, hey, I really didn't want to ask in class, but what did you really mean by that?
Yeah, yeah.
Bugging you, because we're both really into communicating.
Or I think this is all wrong because,
And up there, I had both of our addresses. And the other thing is we will have a shared web server for the class, and I put that up there, and the Kyoto University students will participate, and I encourage you all to visit there as soon as possible. There's some information on the $100 laptop on there. It's just a skeleton. Please, you guys, take control, add content to it. We'd love you to post little thumbnail pictures and who you are and interests. We'd love to get discussions going on some of these topics over the course of the class and use it as another mechanism to discussing. Some of you are probably more comfortable with writing your thoughts and exchanging that way, maybe more than orally here in the class. So that is an alternative method. So
yeah, and in your emails, indicate whether it's okay to have them posted. We won't post anybody's email who doesn't want to have it posted, but if somebody writes something interesting and they don't say, I will write back and ask you if we can, just to get it up there. One of the things we should talk about is laptops, since we've been talking about the $100 laptop. So it is unbelievable in this year of 2005 how few students have their own laptops. It's amazing. And this is true at Stanford, so don't feel bad. So on the other hand, we need to have, for a bunch of the stuff that we're doing, we need to have laptops here, and in the past we have rustled up a bunch for people who don't have them. So can we see hands of people who don't have their own laptop?
Or wouldn't have access to maybe borrow one. I mean, you wouldn't have to bring it to class every single time, but it might
So
soon.
how many people don't have accessible laptops?
So
I
about
mean,
3 or 4 people.
probably
And that's
borrow.
pretty good. So
Yeah.
that's the good news, that like all of you guys didn't raise your hands. But I've made a friend here in, I'm not even sure what department he's in, but I have accessibility to loaner. It's an IBM ThinkPad. It's not like shiny, wonderful, super fat, but it'll do the job. And so if you'd like to check one of those out for the quarter and have one available, let me know, and I'll put you in touch with him and arrange for you guys to have a laptop.
Yeah, we could possibly bring 4 laptops next time, maybe, and just do it. Or do you want to do it through this guy?
I could, it's probably the easiest to put the student directly in touch with him, and then you guys could go see him and check it out. And,
Yeah.
you know, just sign something that you have it for the fortnight. And I think it may have said, but also in the Swiggy, there is one book for the class, and you know, this is the thing I love about universities, is I finally get to do what my teachers do. Is I happen to write it, so revenge. You know, it's actually a project book that's an introduction to this system that Alan was talking
Right.
about, that's known as Squeak, and this is what we call the e-toy, sort of.
And of course, you don't have to buy it.
You don't have to buy it.
It will be useful.
They should have it at the bookstore. It's available on Amazon. It's available even a little cheaper, I think, through sweetland.org, because Amazon marks up the price a few bucks, I think. And that will be useful to you if and when you go to try to, make something in the system yourself. And I must say, there's a great essay by Alan at the end of that book. There's an afterword that Alan wrote, and the Japanese student. The book was published in Japan in January of this year, so the Japanese students will have the same book. So it might. So in the media section of Squeakland, there's an older reading list that Alan put together of some of his kind of favorite books of all time. So it's fun to prowl through, because there's, as you can imagine, there's a big span.
I got asked for my 10 favorite books, so I wrote down 400 or so.
He taught a course.
And there's a bunch that. I will say one thing, and again. One of the things we did in the middle of the class, wasn't last year, was it the first? It was the first year, wasn't it? First year, in the middle of the thing, we were talking about the effect of education on people. And one of the students in the class said, well, isn't this subversive? And I said, yeah, that's the point of it. And what did Socrates say about that? And the student didn't know. And so we polled the class, and we found out that not a single student in that class had ever read a single dialogue of Plato, even coerced. They had not even been coerced to read it. And so it's one of those, no, we're not going to ask. But one of the things that was amazing was, if you're only going to read one, the Apology. The Apology. That was the first one that Plato wrote. It was Socrates' combination defense and goading of the Athenian council, goading them into condemning him to death. And it's all about, the charges were that he corrupted the youth of Athens. And, yeah, deep stuff. So part of the reason some of this stuff is regarded as great is because some of these earlier writers were able to home in the most excruciating fashion on important things in human mind and the way we deal with each other. That's why that stuff was there, and it makes the conversations sparse when there's not this stuff that used to be called education available. And that class, as was the one last year, were basically juniors and seniors. So they were almost ready to graduate from college, and they hadn't touched this one particular aspect. It just happens that our civilization is essentially Greek. Right? Almost all of our important ideas were originally surfaced in a recognizable form by these guys, and nobody knows exactly why. And the particular form of thinking that allows us to do math and science was invented by them. And nobody knows exactly why. And the particular ways we think about justice, and so, but anyway.
Real quick around
Yeah,
this.
yeah, so let's go around now, and
What do you want to know?
I'd just like to hear from people of, of course we may never see some of these people again. We've possibly scared them to death. But even if you're decided not to come back, we'd like to hear from you. So we're going to start with you, and just tell us your name and what you're interested in.
My name's Chris. So
Not concerned with this class, just what are you interested in?
what am I interested in? That's another grand question. I like tinkering. Ever since I was little, I like to take things apart, put them back in some hopefully recognizable manner. Sometimes they actually work.
That's good.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't have a whole
That's
lot
good.
of time, just
Yeah.
the quickie is.
My name's Joseph, and interested in academics academically in the area of programming languages and how knowledge is effectively captured for a particular problem.
My name is Jeff, and I'm interested in everything pretty much. I like thinking about stuff. I don't like deciding. So making decisions is not my strong point. But yeah, I mean, I like everything pretty much.
My name is Adriana. I have a background in social communication, so I'm interested basically my own research is about social uses of novel technologies, especially cell phones and how they're used by different. And I active professionally interested in looking at use of technology to measure and assess what people know.
My name's Anthony, and I'm interested in machine learning and artificial intelligence as far as improving noise communications.
One of these days we'll have it.
My name is Yvonne, and I'm interested in getting girls into technology.
Yay. Okay.
My name's Linda, and I used to be a teacher, so I'm looking at learning in classrooms and technology.
And now you're a graduate student in, right. Yep, red hair.
I'll start.
Yeah.
My name is Ben. I'm interested primarily in computer graphics.
My name is Eitan. My interest is in interactive media art and tools to enable that. Or maybe interactive media is for self-expression. That's a little bit.
I'm Adam. I'm in computer science. I'm interested in programming languages and human languages linguistics.
My name's Brent. I like business and technology, incorporating that. I was actually going to take this quarter off to work, but this is too cool. So.
My name is Brianna. I'm interested in pharmaceutical chemistry.
You better show up on Thursday.
I'm Eric. I'm in computer science. I'm interested in networking, distributed computing, embedded computing.
I'm Alex, and I'm interested in implementing programming languages and search engines sometimes.
Great.
So, my name is Jane. I'm a computer science major. I don't like computers that much. So if I could get through my CS degree without having to interact with the computer, I'd be very happy. My special interest is human-computer interaction because I want to know if there's anything I could do that could attract people like me to interact with computers because it's inevitable.
That's good.
See, that's the problem. There's no one that does
Actually,
that.
I'll tell you, one of the best advisors I had in graduate school had exactly your attitude. He was one of my favorite people. He was pretty scary. You don't look that scary,
So
but
can I ask what year you are then? You're a CS student, right?
Right. I'm a first year grad student.
So you made it through, were you CS for undergrad?
I was CS and econ undergrad, so econ balances it.
Uh-huh.
that's pretty cool.
Okay, my name is David, and my interest is information systems, but I'm also an educator. I teach high school students programming. So
David is a bit of a glutton for punishment, I think.
that I am. But I'm interested in everything, and that's why I came here. So.
Great.
My name is Yanzhou, and I'm in computer science department. And my interest is realize I can design automation for systems.
My name is Ethan Fan. I'm doing the same as Ian. Specifically interested in architecture design. Yeah.
Okay, so the rallying cry from 40 years ago, I want to adopt as the rallying cry for this class, and that is end users first. Going even further, children first. It's the only way computer people can reasonably cope with computers. If you put anything else before the end user, you're dead. But once you start there, there's a lot of stuff that, for people who like hardware and tinkering, you can wind up doing. It's amazing what a different kind of computer architecture you would actually come up with if you put somebody in the third world first. Because we don't want to give up any of the now, we can't afford to do it as wastefully as Intel does. Right? We cannot burn power just to compute simple displays. And if you think about it, you only have to compute a display 30 times a second. So if you could compute the entire display in parallel, you could run that silicon so slow that it would be on the other side of the power curve. And just everything is like that. Once you decide you got to solve this problem for the person, the other ideas and the other things that's talked about are much easier to think about. Whereas it's almost impossible to take electrons and drive them into a design. Right? It's not totally impossible, but it's... So one of the things that we're going to be talking about off and on is the flip side of reductionism. Right? There's no question that reductionism is one of the great ideas of all time. It's just our science is organized around it. Wonderful things have happened because of these assumptions. But in fact, almost everything that we're interested in is the other thing that also exists, which is emergent properties that you get by going the other way. And the extent to which this might even be true in physics is turning out to be more and more apparent and more astounding, to the point that many of the fundamental things in the universe that were thought to be things that would be first principles are turning out to look much more like emergent properties. Just to give you one to chew on, mass is one of those things that looks like it's an actual emergent property from having a bunch of other things happening, and it's possible that even electrons and positrons. I found out something I didn't know just a few weeks ago. Actually, the best book I've read in the last 5 years was called More is Different. If you're interested in books by the Nobel Prize winner Bob Laughlin at Stanford. And this is, God, it's absolutely the most interesting book about the state of physics today that I've read in a long, long time. And I did not know, for example, that the holes in semiconductors, things where electrons aren't, behave exactly like positrons. I knew they were kind of like positrons, but I didn't know that they behave exactly like positrons. But anyway, that's another subject. But if you think about it, in the problem that we're talking about here, a lot of the things that are the most interesting here are things where we have to deal with populations of things. And so it's the emergent properties. And as we'll discover, I'll show a few things next week, that although the little individual graphics that kids move around are interesting, even more interesting is when they can move 20,000 things around. Because the 20,000 things interact with each other in a way that is completely unsuspected. Okay, thanks for everybody. Thank you.
So if you don't have an enrollment number and you want to officially enroll now, you can come see me and I'll give you one if you want to think about it.
Thank you.
And if you want to understand. Oh,
I'll talk. Yeah, next week. Next time.
Thursday. Next class. You're going to come on.